Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So, I always like to bring proof or something showing what I'm talking about so it isn't just sounding like it's something that I've made up or it's make believe. I always like to, I feel like, articles that state a lot of what I've been talking about are proof that in many cities in California, Black or African Americans are being displaced because of the housing crisis. So California's endless housing crisis. So I have many Blacks are displaced in California due to this housing crisis that's here. And so I did a video about the outbreak that has been happening because of a lot of the homelessness and then people that are put out in situations where they're on the street and they are suffering from severe homelessness. And that is a big problem in California all over, and it is growing. And despite what you're hearing about jobs are up, let me tell you something. They're not really telling you all of what's going on here in California. So there's a huge problem that they have here. California has an endless housing crisis. And so this is by C.R. Mills. This is 2018, May 9th. So the media in California supplies a constant flow of coverage on the state's housing crisis. A recent LA Times headline, for example, simply began with, "Yes, California has a housing crisis." But a lot of times they don't want to talk about it when they talk about job growth and, the economy. Sometimes they'll switch it up and make it sound, sweet and savory as if everything is going well. But that's only for a select few. However, we do have an ongoing problem with homelessness and housing crisis. So it goes on to say that a new podcast devoted to the state housing policy brazenly calls itself the California Housing Crisis Podcast. So, and in the lead up to the recently stalled housing bill, which is SB 827, the housing crisis was consistently cited as the reason for why the bill's upzoning of significant swaths of California was necessary. And so to the left, you'll see a construction site, and it's showing where they're trying to develop some housing because there's a supply, a shortage supply, and more housing that is needed for this crisis. And so the state is indeed in a harrowing circumstance regarding housing, including its status as the home of more than 20% of the homeless people in the U.S., but the only 12% of its population. So the spike in residents on the street in California has led to an increase in public health issues. So this coincides with what I was talking about, the outbreaks, so that you know that it's not something that's being made up. It also includes not only what we're hearing now about the typhus, but including a recent hepatitis A outbreak in San Diego. And a recent report revealed that the rising rents have caused at least 30% of the people living in the state's metropolitan areas, which are the populated cities, to be unable to afford the rent prices in their communities. And these are communities, mind you, that people have lived, grown up in, went to school, have families in practically almost all their lives. But they're now being priced out of these communities. However, the widespread hand wringing over the California housing crisis obscures two crucial facts about housing in the state. So the first is the low-income communities and communities of color, which are Black people, Hispanic people, Latin people, have been dealing with a perpetual lack of affordable, decent housing, a real housing crisis for many decades now. So this isn't something new. This has been ongoing, and it's still going, and it's gotten out of control. And so, in many ways, recognition of the current crisis stems from the middle and upper income Californians finally being impacted. And so, the reason why it's being recognized a little more now is that now you have this middle class that we had that is also being impacted by this housing crisis, and upper income people are also being impacted in ways where they have to be savvy about where they're staying, what they can afford. They may be making the money, but the cost of living is so expensive. The pay is not going up fast enough to be able to keep up with it. And so, and using their power to push for solutions that would address their predicament. Unfortunately, these solutions remain almost entirely market-based and fail to address the underlying lack of truly affordable housing that low-income people have had to contend with for many years, So since 1970, the gap between Californians' home prices and those for the rest of the country has been growing. Between 1970 and 1980 alone, home prices in California rose from 30% above national levels to at least 80% higher. By 1990, lower income residents were bearing the burden of this trend, with nearly 3 out of every 4 Californians who make half the state median income or less considered housing cost burdened, paying more than 30% in their income towards the housing. So the situation affects communities of color even harder, and it is a trend that continues to this day. So the percentage of housing cost burden renters in California is greater for households that identify as Black or African American, Latino or Hispanic, and American Indian or Native Alaskan Native, Pacific Islander also, compared to those who identify as white households. So the more recent designation of our current situation as a crisis and the attention paid to its reflects the fact that in recent years, housing has become unaffordable for middle income and white communities as well. As a recent California Department of Housing and Development report detailed, being that housing cost burden is a near universal experience for low-income renters. But in the highest cost metropolitan areas, cost burden is rapidly spreading among moderate income households. So it is growing. It's not getting any better. So it is affecting people who thought at one time, people who were making a little bit more than the lower income bracket, or they were upper than middle class. They were right in between. They're struggling. They're beginning to feel some effects of this. So it isn't getting better. It's gotten a lot worse. So with all of this in mind, it is easier to understand that the reasoning behind recent bills like SB 827, which as originally proposed sought to increase supply without ensuring increased affordability. So for low-income Californians, decreased housing affordability wasn't an issue of concern for many until it started making middle-class life uncomfortable. So when it started impacting the people that were making a little bit higher than lower income, that's when this started hitting the fan more often. You started seeing these articles coming out because as long as it wasn't affecting people who could afford it, or at least they were in there, it wasn't as big of an issue. You know, when it's always poor or people in poverty or low income, they're always struggling. So, oh, well, sorry, that's the attitude. But now that it's affecting people who they're working and they put in time, they're, making a little more than the lower income bracket, but they're feeling a pinch. They're feeling they have less to spend, less less that is left over for leisure, and you're having to start to feel this pressure that, oh my gosh, we can't do this. We got to put money away for this because, we can't afford this anymore. They're starting to feel it. And so now it's becoming an issue. And so, similar to healthcare, housing represents a basic element of survival that most would argue every human deserves. Yet, also similar to healthcare, our current system treats housing and another basic human right as a commodity, as if, you know, if you got it, you got it. And if you're able to afford it, great. But if not, so sorry. It's sort of like people have this nonchalant attitude until it starts affecting them. So developers construct um, housing units not to ensure that everyone in California has a roof over their head. Okay. So even though they're doing this development and building, like I said, they have lofts, they have condominiums downtown, and they can say it's affordable, but to whom? It's still not affordable for the average family, that doesn't make a lot of money. And it's more for the wealthier or the richest of rich, or people who are right there close to that higher income bracket, that it doesn't affect as much. So they can afford those places to live, possibly, but people that are middle class and that are lower income or next to almost don't make very much. They have to work 2, 3 jobs just to pay bills and what have you, and make it from month to month. They wouldn't qualify for that, even that what they call affordable housing. So it's getting really bad. So in practice, this means that housing gets built for not for those who need it most, but for whoever will make developers the most money. So the result is luxury condo towers that provide an investment opportunity for the rich rather than homes that our low-income Californians can actually afford. Despite a massive need for affordable housing, the state currently has 300,000 unit surplus of above moderate income rental housing. And so that's people who pretty much do very well relatively income wise. Or as David Madden and Peter Marcuse put it so succinctly in their book, In Defense of Housing, the housing crisis is not a result of the systems breaking down, but of the system working as it is intended. So, as with other commodity markets, the race for profit in the housing market ultimately creates a massive disparity between winners and losers, and competitors dwindle, and economic power is increasingly consolidated. For example, in Sacramento, investment firms began buying up single-family homes soon after the housing crash. So this ultimately resulted in the in any of the entities in Sacramento County. And so it resulted in a single investment firm of Blackstone Group owning more than single family homes than in any entity in Sacramento County. So the makings of the monopoly are now in place, with Blackstone having an ability to significantly manipulate the cost of single family rental housing in the Sacramento area. So mind you, I want to mention too that they've even bought houses so that they can rent the houses out to people. You don't actually have to buy them. You can rent them out if you can afford it. So such monopolies are natural outgrowths of capitalism. And without a significant public sector housing supply, things will continue to even get worse. So California should be careful when they hear the term housing crises. While it may accurately describe the situation in our state, it can be used to ram through proposals and do very little to solve the problems. Okay, so the pretext for introducing SB 827 was that it would help by massively upzoning housing around transit centers. So the strategy supposedly would have helped solve the housing crisis by providing an increased supply of housing, but risks widespread gentrification and displacement in the process. And meaning the gentrification where they build all these lofts and these condos and luxury condos and buy these homes and rent them out and lease out condos, but you really can't buy them because it's so expensive, and you almost can't darn near rent them out because they want an upward of $3,000 a month, as if you're paying a mortgage note on a condo or on, you know, a luxury condo, or if it's, say, like a regular condo, even not even a luxury condo, or a loft, which a loft doesn't necessarily have to have a bedroom in it. It's just more for like people who are like in the higher income brackets, and they live like, you know, hipsters and what have you, and they work corporate. Um, so it's also causes like lower income people or middle class who don't make as much money. They don't tend to make enough for those type of projects to live in, and so they become displaced and have to move further out to seek housing that is more affordable. So the effort was similar to putting a bandage on a gaping wound. Nothing will change for the communities of color and millions of low-income Californians until we address the underlying problem, which is near total commodification of a basic human right. These people will be displaced. A great deal can be learned from affordable housing advocates who, for decades, have pushed the state to truly address the housing crisis. These advocates have long recognized the quick fixes do not exist. So we need, which you hear in the news how they're saying that they're going to put temporary shelters up or makeshift shelters up for people who are out in the street. That's like temporary fixes. And so we need a sustained commitment to public funds if we ever hope to address the long-term need of all residents. So one specific proposal recently offered that would help heal our housing wounds can be found in the recent People's Policy Project report, Social Housing in the United States. So the report author suggests that constructing a large number of government-owned municipal housing developments would provide a powerful new source of units that would serve all income levels and communities. Unlike the past American public housing, like the projects and what have you, every resident in the communities they're built in would be eligible to live in them, regardless of their income. So it wouldn't just lump all low income people in one big project, and then you have all these other issues that people are talking about, you know, how some people don't strive to do better. You pretty much make everyone inclusive so people can live in these areas and be included. And so dramatic proposal like this are what will truly solve our real housing crisis and the long-term historical situation that will remain until we truly begin to process the providing real alternatives to commodified human rights. And so I wanted to shift. This is Shelter Forest, Voices of the Community Development. And so this is what this is. And so this was recently addressing the housing crisis here in California. And so we also have a history of housing practices in Long Beach. Rising housing costs are resegregating the Bay Area, studies that show this. And so I'm going to shift over to some of these issues. A major Californian housing bill failed after opposition from the low. That's out of LA Times. So this has been a problem. So this one I found to be very interesting. It says, we're being pushed out, the displacement of Black Oakland. Okay. This is out of The Guardian. This also talks about the housing crisis that is going on. We're being pushed out, the displacement of Black Oakland. Okay, California. And so this is Theo Williams at Oakland's Lake Merritt above here, pictured here. And so This is an ongoing situation that has been going on. After police were called on a barbecue of Black Oaklanders share stories of racism and evictions. Okay, so a lot of Black people have been displaced because of flat out racism. Kinsey Smith can't get the voice out of his head. The woman could have ended his life with a single phone call, he said, and her threatening words that play on repeat. So the 37-year-old Oakland man made headlines last month when a white woman called the police on him for barbecuing at Lake Merritt, a public park he has frequented since he was a child. So Jennifer Schultz, who called 911 to complain about the Smiths' use of the charcoal grill, was soon nicknamed Barbecue Becky. And so it's becoming that the subject of viral memes now, Barbecue Becky, and the most recent symbol of white Americans harassing Black people. So every time I look at that spot, it's a constant reminder of that. And I'm always going to hear that voice, Smith said on a recent sunny morning, standing in the grass where weeks earlier his leisurely Sunday had turned into a nightmare. I honestly thought that I was going to die. So Smith's story reignited a national debate about racism in America, but in Oakland, the episode triggered a more acute pain that's going on. So for some, it was a powerful depiction of the rapid displacement of Black Oakland, a trend that for years has been a dramatic in San Francisco just across the bay. So while African Americans in Oakland have been steadily displaced by gentrification, others who remain are treated like criminals in their own hometowns. Okay, so it's called ground zero for displacement. Okay, so Oakland was a critical destination for African American families who migrated from the South in the 1940s, a home to a Harlem of the West. And so jazz blues scene in the 1950s and the birthplace of the Black Panther Party in the 1960s. So the government, however, systematically devastated the city's Black communities throughout the 20th century. So officials constructed freeways, train tracks, federal buildings, and literally destroyed homes and tore neighborhoods apart. Federal redlining is what they call it, practiced embedded racial inequity and segregation into the city's development, with banks allowing wealthy white communities to flourish while denying home ownership to Black families. A corrupt police agency brutalized and jailed many innocent Black citizens. So my question is when does it stop? Said Reverend Thomas Harris III, the longtime pastor of a Pleasant Grove Baptist Church in the West Oakland. And so while the typical service once brought 75 to 100 congregants, the numbers have dwindled as little as 25 as Black families have been pushed out of the area. And so this is what the church is now looking like. It's very sparse out, and it's not as many congregants because there is not very many Black people living in that area because a lot of them have been moved out or displaced. So the congregants during a Sunday service at the Pleasant Grove Baptist Church is photographed above right here. So now the biggest threat facing working class Black citizens and families who survived decades of racist policies and the extreme housing crisis plaguing the region. Pressured by the nation's priciest real estate in San Francisco and the neighboring Silicon Valley tech boom, Oakland has one of the fastest rising rents in the U.S. And so while Black residents made up nearly half of Oakland's population in the 1980s, that figure dropped to 28% by 2010. And if current trends continue, it could fall to about just 16% over the next decade. So some have been pushed too far away, the suburbs and central California towns, hours away out of their cities where they have grown up, lived all their lives. Others have returned to the South because the cost of living in the South is a lot cheaper, or so it is right now. It's beginning to grow. So it's ground zero in the United States right now for this kind of intensity of high housing costs and displacement, said Hudson, a Columbia University urban planning professor. So 47 years of living there in July, she said that her first stop would probably be a relative's couch hours away. After that, she doesn't know what she's going to do. So, three generations of Hardy's family are now being forced out of homes that they've always lived in for 5 decades. A painful process that began after the engineer at Intel purchased the 3-unit property they have long rented in the West Oakland. 69-year-old woman of age once who once worked for the public school systems lives in an upstairs apartment while her daughter and granddaughter share a unit downstairs, and Hardy's son was living in the third unit until Itua Oye Honwan, a new landlord. It's a long name, so it's a different pronunciation. I'm sorry if I didn't say it correctly. Has moved him out, saying that he would be moving in. So we are being pushed out of our community, said Hardy in tears as she sat on her daughter's couch recounting how a group of working class black women built up the neighborhood and lamenting that their families can no longer reap the benefits of what they've worked so hard for and they've lived all their lives to be in. So we are treated like we don't really belong here. It seems like our communities are so dispensable. And so Oyi Honlan is also black and was born in Oakland, but Lise Simon Westberg, Hardy's attorney, said that the trend she has seen in recent years was wealthy younger landlords and large management companies buying rent control properties with the goal of turning big profits by removing low-income families. And so this is what they've been doing. And it's not just happening in Oakland. It's not just happening in the Bay Area. It's happening even in the Los Angeles and Pasadena and other areas as well. And so in many of her cases, the lawyer said that they are predatory. Okay, these people that have been doing this, they're about money. They don't really care about the people who have spent many years and grown up and have families there. So they understand that they'll be able to push people out by doing this. So Hardy said that she has suffered from panic attacks since Oye Hanlan bought her home, and that she could not begin to think about moving her belongings, including heirlooms passed down from her great-grandmother who was once a slave in Louisiana. So I thought I'd be here until I couldn't climb those steps anymore. So Oye Hanlan did not respond to any inquiry, and his attorney declined to comment. So when white neighbors called the police, so that's rehearsal. Okay, so this is something else unrelated. So Theo Williams is a native Oaklander, an African-American artist who has found a way. But in recent years, at least one neighbor has been less than pleased with his presence. So on 27th of September 2015, Williams, who grew up by Lake Merritt in the 1980s, was part of a small drum circle. Okay, his group is a picture up here. Okay, they're members of the Samba Funk, or the Samba Funk. It's a funk quarians at the rehearsal. Okay, so he's probably in the middle, I believe. And so it's a group of people there in a band. Okay, and they're pictured up top here. So I guess when they practice, it says when a white man who said that lived nearby showed up to the lake, to try and stop them. I guess they were doing their drum circle in his group, and I guess they were practicing, or it was something that they normally do. And so somebody found that they didn't like it. So the man said that they were violating the noise ordinance. But the group, which had been drumming for several years there and was outside for a rare lunar eclipse, sorry. So they kept playing their drums, and a confrontation then ensued. And according to Williams, the man tried to grab his drumsticks away from him. And so this is sort of like a culture of a band and people who have lived there for a long period of time, and they probably were coming out to a festive lunar eclipse where everybody gathers together. And this guy, who's new in the neighborhood, didn't like what they were doing, and he said there's a noise ordinance. A squad of officers showed up. The call assaulted. So prosecutors ultimately decided not to file the charges. So it was a humiliating experience and disrespectful, but it was also a sense of disbelief that this was really starting to happen, that this person would exercise this much privilege. Williams said, "So you don't own me," he says. So over the years, Williams, who has lived in a small artist studio, said that he has long experienced racial profiling and police harassment in his hometown. So my personal history is constantly getting detained, constantly getting asked questions, and actually it becomes a very traumatic experience. But when the white resident new to the community tried to suppress Black culture like music and arts, residents said it can be particularly very hurtful. So not long after the drumming controversy, Pleasant Grove Baptist Church began receiving noise complaints for loud music, and the city responded by threatening a $3,529 fine plus penalties of $500 a day if the noise continued, saying that the property was the site of a nuisance activity. And so it was disturbing that they've been getting this. And so this is a church that's long been there, so they're saying that they're making noise. And so how can someone come into the community and begin to dictate to somebody who has been there for many years, said Harris. So we thought that we enhanced the community, not bringing it down. And so Elder Ron Rawson, then an associate pastor, said that the anonymous neighbors filing noise complaints were bullying people and that it seemed racially motivated. More than likely it is. But he noted that historical significance of religious music for Black communities dating back to slavery, it's our communication and ways of talking to one another musically. So it's our liberty. Okay, so to be told not to do so, that or not to do that, and to not express yourself in that way, that is not who we are. So that's not how we do church. And so church is a lot about, also expressing themselves through music and hymns and songs and drumming and whatnot. So the hostility towards Black people in a gentrifying Oakland can extend beyond cultural institutions as well. So when a Whole Foods store had opened in an abandoned car dealership near Marlena Henderson's home, her family was thrilled to have organic produce begin shopping there regularly, she said, until the 21st of December 2017. So this is her pictured here, Marlena Henderson and her son photographed right here. And so the day of her 13-year-old son's walked into the store by himself to purchase some Christmas gifts for his mother. He had saved up and called his mother on the phone, who talked to him about possible gifts like scarves and body products. She recalled when he later returned home empty-handed and too upset to speak. She knew something really went wrong. So the store security staff, according to Henderson, had accused her son of trying to steal, saying that he looked suspicious shopping for the woman's products, okay, and that they saw him enter the bathroom with his basket. And so they ultimately escorted him out of the building. And she said that the manager later defensive, claiming that her son frequently tried to steal in the store and questioning how he could have the money to afford the potential gifts. So he had the money to buy the gifts for his mother, and he was still questioning on how he got the money. So he was humiliated and traumatized by that experience for all of trying to be responsible, trying to be generous, and trying to do something good, and going to a place he knew that I loved, she said, the mother, adding that it could have gotten to a point where somebody called the police on his son and could have her son and could have shot her son for just being there. And so Whole Foods did not respond to the request for the comment, though they no longer shop there anymore because of the altercation they had with the security guard in the store. But the family lives nearby and cannot avoid the reminder, Henderson said. It's a memory for him that will sting him for life. So leaving it all behind. For some forced out of Oakland, there's no turning back. So it was no longer, I was no longer willing to fight. So it was too taxing for me, said Karna Leggett. Okay, a 45-year-old lifelong Oaklander who recently moved to Texas after her father had died. So she said that she wanted to stay in her home, which she had rented since 1999, and where her father had lived for about 40 years, but negotiating with her landlord, who was trying to take control of the property, dragged on for more than a year. Eventually, she gave up the fight, and they had made living there so distasteful to her that I just wanted to leave it all behind, Leggett said. Okay, so Daniel Bornstein, an attorney for the landlord, said Leggett voluntarily left after reaching an amicable settlement. Okay, so Leggett doesn't know how long she'll stay in Texas, but one thing she said seemed clear, that she'll never be able to live in Oakland again because of that, how expensive the living is there and how the treatment is as well. So some have found ways of resisting. In 2015, after the noise complaints against Black musicians, residents organized a Make a Joyful Noise celebration, taking over a public street. And this month, hundreds showed up at Lake Merritt for the barbecue while Black event to protest that the police call by Schultz, who could not be reached for comment, helped clean up the section of the lake where many have been holding barbecues in solidarity for that family and for him. I don't want to give anyone any reason to complain, he said. So since you're here, looks like there's more here. Okay, so this is talking about the Guardian, how they're trying to keep it operating. So that's basically just some accounts from people who have lived in the Bay Area and the Oakland area and things they've experienced as Black residents, how they've been treated and profiled and what have you. And so this is prevalent. And so the thing is that now they've gotten so bold that they feel that it's okay to do this to people. And the police tends to back some of these people up because they have the money and they can afford to live there and do so. And so this right here, Sam Levin in Oakland, Sam Levin. Okay, so June 2018. So this is what has been going on in the Oakland area in terms of gentrification and the housing crisis. And so it's all over California. It has been happening. It's a big problem and it is growing. It's been happening. Okay, so how the housing crisis segregates the Bay Area. This is out of the Mercury News, September 19, 2018. Soaring housing prices are more likely to displace Bay Area families of thousands of low-income Black families left Richmond and Bayview. Okay? And so this is so you know that this is something that has been ongoing and it has grown. So despite what they're saying about jobs are up and all of this stuff, they're not telling people about what is really going on in these neighborhoods and how people have been treated. So how housing crisis segregates the Bay Area. Okay, this is by our Marissa Kendall, September 19, 2018. Bay Area soaring housing costs are pushing out low-income families of color at a greater rate than the white counterparts, according to the new study that highlights how the region's chronic affordability crisis is exacerbating racial disparities and creating new pockets of segregation. And so this is happening and it is growing rapidly. Thousands of low-income Black families left Richmond in the Bay Area and San Francisco, the flatlands of Oakland and Berkeley between thousands to 2015, changing the demographics of the neighborhoods. Those families were more likely to be shunted into segregated neighborhoods with poor environmental quality and less access to quality education and job opportunities. And so I want you guys to hear what is truly happening in this California. And it's not just in California either, believe it or not. It's growing everywhere. So at the same time, the population of low-income Black households grew in areas with lower prices like Antioch, Pittsburgh, San Leandro, parts of Hayward, and unincorporated Ashland, Cherryland, and Alameda County, according to the data released Wednesday. UC Berkeley's Urban Displacement Project and California Housing Partnership, which focused on Alameda, Contra Costa, and San Francisco counties. And so it's very, very striking, said Dan Rensler, senior policy analyst with the California Housing Partnership. Race plays such an important part in the housing market in terms of where people get to live. So in the nine county Bay Area, census tracts where rents rose to 30% between 2000 and 2015 saw a mass exodus of low-income families of color as just over 1 in 5 left, but no change in their population of low-income white holes, according to the reports. Okay, so the researchers said that the data offers no insight into why families of color are affected so differently from white families. Okay, so the report quantifies what local organizations have known for a long time, said Jahamis Meres, Deputy Director of the East Bay Alliance for Sustainable Economy. It is, in fact, Black and brown folk, people of color, typically low-income people of color who are displaced from their communities, she said, and then experiencing the stress of finding new housing stability, longer commutes, and disconnection from their communities, and then all of the stress that goes along with that. So California Dream is tough to afford if you're under the age of 40. Is the California Dream over? So even people who are younger now that are people of color will eventually be affected by this. So in 2015, low-income white households in Alameda County were 7 times more likely to live in higher resource areas than moderate to high-income Black households, according to the report. And in San Francisco, low-income Black households were more likely to live in segregated, high-poverty areas in 2015 than they were in the 2000s, in the early 2000s. The disparity reflected in Wednesday's report come after decades of redlining and other discriminatory practices. The UC Berkeley and California Housing Partnership researchers have written this. So the legacy of that continues on and on, even though we believe that we've moved beyond that, said Miriam Zuck, UC Berkeley's Urban Displacement Project Director. So North Oakland's Longfellow neighborhood lost 400 of its low-income Black households between the years of 2000 to 2015, the largest loss in Alameda County, according to the report. So many of the North Oakland and Berkeley neighborhoods that lost low-income Black families gained high-income white families as the replacement. So for many low-income families, moving offered little improvement. Okay, so the East Oakland, 3 of the zip codes where the low-income Latino population grew, led to the county in child lead poisoning cases. Okay, so Latino people, you're affected as well in this. Throughout Alameda County, the report found that low-income residents who moved in 2015 ended up spending more of their income on rent, not less. Extremely low-income renters who didn't move spent 68% of their income on rent. And so that leaves little room to do anything else. And so most people stay put until they can no longer afford it. They end up homeless and in shelters and what have you, or living out of hotels and motels, or living with family members. But that jumped to about 85% if they are left in the county for another part of the Bay Area, 80% of that percent if they moved out of the region entirely. And so that could mean those residents who are moving from rent-controlled to otherwise affordable homes into to the market rate homes. So, or it could reflect a loss of income that precipitated the move. Okay, so the researchers have said this. So that is probably one of the key things here. Families are hurting when they're moving, Zuck said. The findings challenging the notion that residents who are struggling to afford Bay Area housing can easily pack up and move somewhere cheaper, she said. Okay, so they also suggest that Bay Area politicians and affordable housing advocates should be investing more resources in helping residents stay in place and avoid costly and harmful moves. So even when people move, you don't know what you're moving into, and you moved away from, and what that could entail later down the road. And so California legislator has sent a bill to the governor, Jerry Brown's desk, that Rensler says would address many of the issues highlighted in Wednesday's report. AB 686 would require public agencies to take proactive steps to further fair housing and combat segregation. So this is like a silent killer, but it's no longer being silent anymore. So the Trump administration suspends a similar federal mandate in January. Okay, so all this housing and everything that's been happening is basically for the wealthy, the super wealthy. So Marissa Kendall covers housing for the Bay Area News Group, focusing on impacts of local companies have on housing availability in the region. She also has written about technology, startups and ventures, and capital for Bay, and covered courts for the recorder in San Francisco. So she started her career in crime reporting in the news press in Southwest Florida. So that's pretty much what's been going on. I just wanted you guys to see that when you hear on the news, they're talking about, oh, jobs are up and jobs growth, and who are they referring to? This is a lot contrary to what you've been seeing on the news. And so they only tell you what you want to, they think you want to hear to tickle the ears of people who are probably doing well, or to make it easier for you to think, oh, nothing's going on, everybody's living good, everybody's got a job and they're happy. And that's not entirely true. So more important to bring out the real issues that are going on, and this is affecting many people, and it's spreading, it's growing. And recently too, they said that there was an issue in the stock market. And so sometimes I feel like that, well, not sometimes, I feel like that's affects people as well. It actually affects more of the wealthy people, but it somehow trickles down to others. But this is getting back to the issues. It's a big problem here in California, and it is stretching out other places as well. I think people realize the severity and how where people of color, their part in this is in this housing crisis that's been ongoing. And so I think people need to really take into account what's really been going on. They don't really realize an pertinent issue in people are being affected by this. And so relatively everywhere. And it's not just in California. I want to add that again. It's not just in California, but all over California is in this housing crisis. And so, being said, thank you for listening. And there are many articles that you can look up on this. This is really a big, huge problem. Thank you for listening.